Hey guys, Max Rich here, and today I wanted to talk to you about staggering your chords, or how to avoid staggering your chords. And it's a common thing I see with players who are starting out, players who haven't quite really mastered their left hand or their fretting hand. If you're left-handed, you know, I'm just going to refer to it as your left hand. But for you lefties, you know what I'm talking about. Staggering your chords is a real common thing. It's like when you go to make a chord, you're putting one finger down. If I'm making a G chord, I put like one finger down, then the next finger, then the next finger, then the next finger. And then when I go to switch chords, I do the same thing. One finger, one finger, one finger. Instead of putting them all down at the same time, right? Obviously this has a ton of disadvantages. You know, if I'm staggering and putting one finger down at a time, it takes me 2, 3, 4 times as long to make the chord. And then when I go to change chords, I have to either start super early, which means I gotta get off of the old chord sooner than I should, or I'm late to the next chord. Either way, it throws your timing off and can be really detrimental for your development as a guitar player, because if you're constantly compensating for your lack of finger independence, it's going to be really bad for your timing and for your ability to play fast, and you know, it generally is a bad habit to have, and so I want to help you guys break that habit. And the most common problem that people have when they stagger their fingers is that their fingertip is pointed essentially in the wrong direction. If you think about it, what you're trying to do when you make a chord is you're trying to move your fingertip to the string, and you're just trying to do that with more than one finger at a time, right? So instead of just one finger moving towards the string, you want to do that with 3, 4, 2, however many fingers you're going to use to make that chord. Whether it's a C chord, a G chord, a bar chord, it doesn't really matter what type of chord it is. The function is the same. Essentially, the fingertip has to move towards the string, and all of them have to do it at the same time. Now, the problem that a lot of players have is that when they go and they remove their hand, like let's say you're starting from a C chord and you're going to move to a G chord. A lot of times what players will do is when they'll take that C chord off to move to the G chord, they'll take their fingers off like that, and then they'll reposition, and then they'll have to like stagger their chord, right? Now the problem is, if you're looking at my guitar from this angle, it might not be easy, but if I change angles of my guitar, if I take my fingers off, right now they're pointed at the strings because they're fretting the strings. If I take my fingers off the way I just did a second ago, right, and then I go to make a chord, now all my fingertips are pointing towards the ceiling. They're no longer pointing towards the strings, they're pointing away from my target. So now when I go to make the G chord, I have to reposition, change the angle of my fingertip, move the fingertips towards the string, and that causes a super huge delay in timing, right? Versus if I get rid of my chord like this, keep my fingertips pointing at the strings, and then I can reposition all at once without my fingertips ever bending like this. Right? Now what essentially is happening here is that when I have my fingertips pointing anywhere other than the string, and then I go to move towards the fretboard to make my chord, I have to try to realign them as I'm moving, right? This is like hitting a moving target, you know? If I'm trying to realign more than one finger simultaneously, I'm trying to go from a stretched out straight position to bending my front knuckles and lining them up with my target strings. That's just like way too much hassle, and you're necessarily going to be late to the party. It's going to happen every single time. It's probably happening, which is why you're watching this video. So the way to avoid that is by moving and changing chords almost exclusively from the big knuckles. Now it's kind of hard to see because these chords are real tight and compact, but if I take like a D chord and I move it to a C chord, right? Notice my small knuckles. Like notice the front digit. You can see it in my index finger. Right? My index finger's right here. When I change chords, my index finger never straightens out. It never comes like this. That front digit is never pointing anywhere except the fretboard. Right? It's never pointing up like this. That's a huge tool that's going to help you overcome this problem, is the fact that your fingertips should always be pointing towards their target. And this is essentially true if you're playing a scale, if you're playing licks, if you're playing a chord. Ideally, you want those fingertips always pointing towards where you're going to be playing next. You know, you don't ever want them up like this, because then when you go to play, you have to realign and then move forward. And once again, that's just a delay in the process. So the question then becomes, how do you go from this habit, right, to this habit? where you're not bending or you're not straightening those front digits, right? Where you're keeping those front knuckles bent. What essentially is happening mechanically in your hand? Well, when you go to change chords, or you go to change notes, and you want to maintain that hook shape in your finger, you have to move almost exclusively or entirely exclusively from the big knuckle. Like if you look at my pinky, if the fretboard is here and I'm going to attack the fretboard, right? When I go to lift off, I don't want to lift off like this. I want to lift off back like that by using my big knuckle exclusively. If I use the middle knuckle, I'll get that. If I use the small knuckle, I have to use the middle knuckle as well. I'll end up straightening. But if I use just the big knuckle, I can maintain that hook shape, right? And so a good exercise for you to do to practice this is, you could do this on your arm. You don't need a guitar to do this. I'll show you how to do it on the guitar, but you can do it on your arm, you can do it on a table, you could do it on any flat surface, really. But essentially, you start by learning how to, without even a guitar or anything, you start by learning how to keep your fingers in a hook shape, pretending that the fretboard is here, and simply moving them by the big knuckle only. And you can move them all at once, right? To start, just like, kind of see if you can even move just the big knuckle without straightening your other knuckles, right? You got 3 knuckles per finger. You want to try to see if you can move just from the big knuckles and maintain that hook shape, right? Now that's all well and good if you're moving all 4 fingers at the same time in the same direction. But a lot of times when you're switching from chord to chord, you need to move different fingers different distances, and you need to move them independently. So that means that you need to have this hook shape, right, in each finger as its own individual unit. It's no good if they all have to move together as a hook. They have to move individually as a hook, right? That's kind of the thing, right? That's the super important part, is that you're able to do this individually. So if you take a guitar, and like once again I said you could do this on a flat surface, your arm or a table or something, right? I'll show you like this. If I just lightly touch the strings, right? And I'm not fretting, I'm not pushing anything down, I'm just like lightly touching the string, right? If I can move one finger back and forward, right, only from the big knuckle, right, that maintains that hook shape. That's what I'm after, right? And you can, your pinky may move a little farther, may move less. Everyone's hands are a little bit different, right? The distance you come off of the guitar, that can change depending on what you're doing. But generally speaking, the idea is to maintain that hook, right? And so you practice like that until you can successfully move each one without the others moving. Like if you're moving your middle finger backwards and your index finger comes off, or you move your ring finger off and your middle finger comes off, that's not what you want, because that means that it isn't moving in a hook shape independently. It's relying on the muscles and the tendons of another finger to help move backward and forward. That's not what you want. You want it to function individually, right? And then you start making things a little more challenging once you're able to do that. You start taking multiple fingers off. So you can do this in a pattern, starting with all the finger combinations starting with 1. So your index finger, so 1 and 2 come off and move forward, right? 1 and 3 come off and move forward, and 1 and 4 come off and move forward, right? And you want to try to get them to land simultaneously. That's the key, right? And in order to do that, they kind of have to move the same distance, right? You see how they're moving like at the same distance? They're not like one's moving way farther than the other or something like that. That's how you get this mistiming. You can get mistimed and staggered chords even if you're doing this hook thing. You can get it by lifting one finger way far off and the other one not far enough off, and they're not evenly coming off the strings, right? If it changed from a C chord to a G chord, right? They all come off at the same distance. It's not like one's coming off here and this one's coming off barely. They're all coming off at the same distance, essentially, right? That's part of this exercise. So you do, 1 and 2, like I said, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, right? And then you do all your finger combinations starting with 2. Now you already did 1 and 2, so you don't need to do that one, although you can, right? But you do 2 and 3. And you want to make it somewhat robotic. Make sure that it's not, you know, like I said, not like staggering or waving or anything like this, that they both come off at the same speed and the same time, and then 2 and 4, right? And then finally the last one is 3 and 4, right? That's essentially what you want. Then you begin to learn how to do that away from the guitar, because remember, this has to happen in the air. You're not actually touching anything except for the back of the neck with your thumb. You have to learn how to do this in the air. So once again, you start taking your hand, and if you look at your hand, you can concentrate on moving just one finger, right? And you kind of want to be a little harsh on yourself. You want to be like, well, really analyzing it and say, like, is any other finger moving at all? Like, if anyone's, you know, doing this or twitching, or like your thumb is doing that or something like this, that means you're recruiting muscle energy from somewhere else in your hand. You want to avoid that, right? Because once again, all of these have to function individually as its own unit, right? And so you want to make sure each one maintains that hook shape and functions on its own individually, right? And you can start 2 different ways, right? This is kind of important. You're not always starting with a motion towards the guitar. Sometimes you're starting a motion away from the guitar as you get off of a chord, and then you have to go back towards the next chord, right? So in that case, instead of starting with a forward motion, you have to start with a backward motion and learn how to go away from the guitar as your first motion, but also towards the guitar as your first motion, right? So they're not symmetrical. Going away from the guitar, you can only go so far, right, before you have to really start bending and like moving your in other digits, right? Going towards the guitar, you can go a lot farther and maintain. You see how my fingertip is like still pointing. It's kind of hard to see. I'll do it with my ring finger. So my fingertip's pointing at the fretboard, and I can keep going. I can keep going. It's still pointing there, right? That's what we want. We want that tip to be pointing at its target, right? While I go away from the guitar, I can only go so far, right? And at some point, my pinky finger might start going with it, right? Because the way the hand is structured, I don't want to get too deep into the anatomy, you know, a lot of your tendons are connected inside your hand. And so I'm sure you noticed if you move your ring finger, sometimes your pinky moves. If you move your ring finger, sometimes your middle finger moves. The idea is to minimize that extra movement of that excess finger as much as possible. So if you're moving your ring finger a bunch, you don't want a lot of movement. You want as minimal movement as possible. And this is something that you have to feel. This is not something that, I mean, you can see it when it happens, but in order to control it, you have to feel the inside of your hand, and you have to sort of isolate that individual muscle and that individual tendon in your ring finger, and try to use, it sounds weird, but like some, you know, Jedi mind trick to like stop that pinky tendon and that pinky muscle from firing, or stop that middle finger tendon and muscle from firing when you're trying to use the ring finger as an individual, right? And this is sort of like how you learn how to control your hand through your mind, right? This is not just like a tactile thing. This has to happen in your mind first. And so the main thing, right, like back to the story at hand, if you're staggering chords and you don't want to anymore because it's slowing you down, you can't play songs fast enough, right? You can't play them at the real speed. The way you do this is by maintaining that hook shape, right? So you lift off and everything comes off and stays facing the target. And then when you go to change the new shape, you obviously have to make the shape in the air. So you need to be familiar enough with the new chord shape that you can kind of, it doesn't have to be exactly accurate, but it has to be pretty close so that you can make that new chord shape in the air, and then you push them all down at the same time using the big knuckle, right? None of this middle or small knuckle. That's just going to force you to try to hit a moving target. Your fingertips pointing in the air when it should be pointing at the string that it's trying to attack, right? The last thing that will prevent you from staggering and flailing all over the place is that when you play chords, the farther apart your fingers are spread, the less they're braced against something, right? Which means, you know, think about it. If you're trying to stand on one foot in your room, wherever you are, is it easier to stand on one foot in the center of the room, or if you're touching the wall? You don't have to be touching the wall very hard, and it's going to be much easier to touch the wall because you're bracing against something. You're taking that like vulnerable, unbalanced position of being on one foot, and you're countering that by touching the wall and balancing yourself that way, right? You have something to brace against. So when I make a chord in the air, if you notice the way I play my C chord, you know, like my fingers are touching. They're not spread apart. They're touching because that way, once again, it's easier to move as one unit. It's like having your fingers splinted together, right? And they're bracing against each other. And then when I go to make my G chord in the air, right, my fingers are all touching. They're not like this. I mean, I don't even know how to make a G chord that way. Same thing with a D chord. I try to play as compact as possible with my fingers as close together as possible. It's not always possible. If I make a big chord like this and I have to have my fingers separate, you know, that's just what it is. There's no avoiding that. But wherever possible, you know, you don't want to make your D chord this way. You want to try to make it this way so that your fingers are bracing against each other and they're not as vulnerable as they are spread out among, you know, multiple strings and with all this space in between. That's like standing on one foot. You may be able to do it, but it's more vulnerable, will require more accuracy and more muscle energy, more concentration, and it's just all around easier if you avoid that by keeping them tight together. So the two things I want you to remember is that learn how to move your fingers so that your fingertips are always facing the target. That means moving from the big knuckle exclusively and doing individual drills so that you can learn how to move one at a time, right? Keeping that finger pointed, keeping that hook shape in your finger. The other one is keeping your hand compact and playing tight, close together. This goes for individual melodies. You know, if I'm playing, right? All my fingers are touching each other. They're not doing this. They're not doing that because I have just so much more vulnerable of a position if I'm spread out like this. Now, once again, it's not always possible, but wherever possible, maintain that tight, compact position. Maybe it's only two fingers and these two are out here. Maybe it's these two. Maybe it's these three. Whatever it is, try to find a way to touch fingers with other fingers, you know, so that you can have something to brace against. Keep that hook shape. Keep moving forward and backward from the big knuckle exclusively, and keep those fingers touching together, and you find yourself staggering chords way less frequently, and hopefully, I've seen it happen very quickly, a week, maybe even less than that. People stop staggering common chords that they're used to taking forever to make, and you start playing songs faster, and you start being more fluent on the fingerboard, and watch yourself improve. So, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please take a look over at maxrichmusic.com. I got a bunch of articles, newsletters, free videos like this, and if you're feeling so inclined, hit that donate button. It helps me create content for you guys, keeping it for free, and keep the guitar tips flowing. So, thank you for watching.